This is the story of Otto Skorzeny, the 6'4" Austrian commando the Allies branded the most dangerous man in Europe, and whose single most famous mission, the operation that made him a legend, he may not have actually planned. For 30 years after the war, Skorzeny let the world believe he was the mastermind behind the daring rescue of Benito Mussolini. Recently declassified German military records and a generation of new historians say the man who actually planned it has been written out of the story, and Skorzeny knew it the entire time. By July 1975, Otto Skorzeny was dead of lung cancer in a Madrid clinic, and former SS officers stood over his grave giving the Nazi salute, singing Hitler's favorite songs. 30 years earlier, in the spring of 1945, he was a Waffen-SS colonel commanding thousands of men on the Eastern Front, wanted by 3 separate intelligence services, and about to walk into an American POW camp under his own name because he believed, correctly, that his fame would protect him. In between those two moments sits a career that touches nearly every major thread of 20th century European history: a mountaintop rescue that made him famous, a kidnapping that toppled a head of state, a disguised tank brigade that shut down a general's Christmas, a war crimes trial that turned on a British spy's testimony, a prison escape staged in broad daylight, and a quarter-century of post-war life spent moving between Cold War intelligence agencies that couldn't quite decide whether he was an asset, a threat, or simply a myth they'd all been chasing for nothing. To understand how a Viennese engineering student became one of the most mythologized soldiers of the 20th century, and how much of that myth he built himself, you have to start decades before the war that made him famous. Before getting into the timeline, here's the direct truth about the approach in this video. Otto Skorzeny wrote his own memoirs after the war, twice, in fact, first as Skorzeny's Special Missions and later as My Commando Operations, and for decades, those books were the primary source most popular histories, documentaries, and even some encyclopedia entries relied on for the details of his career. The problem is that Skorzeny had every incentive to inflate his own role, and historians who've gone back to cross-check his memoirs against surviving German military records, Allied intelligence files, and independent witness testimony have found repeated instances where his account doesn't match the paper trail. This isn't a case of a few exaggerated war stories from an old soldier. It's closer to a deliberate, decades-long project of self-mythologizing, carried out by a man who understood, better than almost anyone of his generation, exactly how reputations get built and maintained. That project didn't stop with his own memoirs, either. Skorzeny gave interviews for the rest of his life, cooperated with sympathetic biographers, and, according to the historians who've studied his post-war career most closely, actively cultivated his own reputation as an unkillable, untraceable master operator, a reputation that, as later sections of this video will show, may have done more to shape Cold War intelligence assessments of him than anything he actually did. So everywhere in this video where a claim traces back only to Skorzeny's own writing, that will be flagged directly. Everywhere a claim is independently corroborated, by German military records, by Allied intelligence documents, by outside historians who've done the archival work, that will be noted too. The gap between those two categories is, in a real sense, the actual subject of this video. Otto Johann Anton Skorzeny was born on June 12, 1908, in Vienna, into a middle-class Austrian family with a long military tradition, in a city and a country still adjusting to a diminished place in Europe after the First World War had shrunk Austria from a multi-ethnic empire into a small, struggling republic. Skorzeny trained as a civil and mechanical engineer at the Technical University of Vienna, and it was there, in the late 1920s, that he picked up the habit German and Austrian university men called academic fencing, dueling with sharpened sabers, not for blood, but for honor and status. In 1928, in his 10th duel, Skorzeny took a blade across the left cheek. The wound was stitched without anesthetic, standard practice for a dueling scar, and it left him with the mark that would define his public image for the rest of his life, a jagged line running down the side of his face that earned him the nickname Scarface long before anyone had heard of Otto Skorzeny the soldier. He was an imposing man even without the scar. At just under 6'4", with a build some contemporaries estimated at around 250 pounds, Skorzeny physically dominated most rooms he walked into. He spoke fluent German, excellent French, and workable English, languages that would matter enormously later in his career. His surname itself carries a small piece of forgotten geography. It traces to Polish origins, back to a place called Skorzeny in the Greater Poland region, before the family line migrated to East Prussia generations before Otto Skorzeny was born in Vienna. The dueling culture Skorzeny grew up inside deserves a moment of its own, because it shaped him more than a single scar. Academic fencing, known in German university circles as Menser, wasn't street violence, it was ritualized, rule-bound combat between university men, fought with sharpened sabers at close range, face and scalp deliberately left exposed, the goal being not to kill but to stand still and take a wound without flinching. A man who had fought and won 10 of these duels by 1928 had spent years training himself specifically not to react to pain or fear in front of an audience. Skorzeny later described that training explicitly as preparation for later life, that what he learned standing still under a saber taught him not to be afraid, and that on a raid, the job was simply to decide on the target and go in. Whether or not every word of that recollection is verbatim, the discipline it describes, controlled, performative fearlessness, maps directly onto the persona he'd spend the next 4 decades cultivating. In May 1932, years before Hitler took power in Germany, Skorzeny joined the Austrian Nazi movement, though the exact year is one of several small discrepancies that turn up across different biographical sources, some of which place his entry as early as 1930 or 1931. 2 years later, in February 1934, he became a member of the Austrian SA, the Nazi Party's paramilitary wing, at a moment when Austrian Nazism was still a banned, semi-underground movement years away from the 1938 Anschluss that would fold Austria into the German Reich. Here's where the story of Otto Skorzeny connects to something almost nobody puts next to a World War II documentary: modern brand marketing. Skorzeny did not become internationally famous because he was the most skilled commando of the war. Historians today are fairly clear that several other Waffen-SS and Brandenburg Division operators had comparable or superior operational records. He became famous because he understood, decades before the term existed, the value of a personal brand. Using the scar, the height, and the biography he wrote and rewrote after the war, Skorzeny built a recognizable, marketable image the same way a modern company builds a logo, and Nazi propaganda under Joseph Goebbels was the distribution network that made Skorzeny a household name across occupied Europe. The product was mythology, and the customer was the German public, desperate in 1943 for a hero. Push the comparison one step further and it holds up surprisingly well. A modern brand needs 3 things to break through: a distinctive visual identifier, a consistent narrative, and a distribution channel with enough reach to make that identifier and narrative unavoidable. Skorzeny had all 3 by September 1943, the scar as the visual identifier, the daring rescue narrative as the story, and the entire Nazi state propaganda apparatus as the distribution channel. Most soldiers who performed comparably impressive feats during the war never had access to distribution at that scale, which is a large part of why their names never became household ones in the first place. Skorzeny's fame was never purely a function of what he did. It was, from the very beginning, a function of who was telling the story, and how widely they were able to tell it. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed into Austria and the Anschluss was completed, the formal annexation of Austria into Nazi Germany. According to Skorzeny's own post-war account, he personally intervened that day to prevent the shooting of Austrian President Wilhelm Miklas, positioning himself between the president and armed men during the chaos of the political transition. That specific claim, like a number of the more flattering anecdotes attached to Skorzeny's name, comes to us only through his own retelling, and should be treated as his personal account rather than an independently verified event. When the Second World War began the following year, Skorzeny tried to join the Luftwaffe. He was rejected. The German Air Force considered him too tall and, at 31, too old for pilot training. Instead, he joined the Waffen-SS and trained with the Leibstandard SS Adolf Hitler, Hitler's original SS bodyguard formation, which by 1939 had grown into a full military division. Skorzeny's climb through the SS rank structure over the next 7 years is documented with unusual precision in surviving German personnel records, and the pace of it tells its own story. He entered as an SS Unterstufenführer, a junior non-commissioned rank, on May 1, 1940. By September of that same year he'd moved up to SS Oberscharführer. On January 30, 1941, he crossed into officer territory as an SS Untersturmführer. Then the promotions stall for 2 full years, a 2-year gap that covers his combat wound, his convalescence, and the period before Gran Sasso, until April 28, 1943, when he became SS Hauptsturmführer, captain. What happens after that tells you everything about how fast fame moved inside the Nazi military bureaucracy. Within 18 months of Gran Sasso, Skorzeny jumped 3 full ranks. Major on September 12, 1943, the day of the raid itself. Lieutenant Colonel on October 16, 1944, immediately after Hungary. Colonel, his final rank, on April 20, 1945, 10 days before Hitler's suicide and 3 weeks before Germany's surrender. A man who spent his first decade in the SS moving 1 rank every year or 2 suddenly moved 3 ranks in 20 months, once the propaganda machine decided he was worth promoting quickly. Laid out on a timeline, his career looks less like a normal military progression and more like 2 entirely different careers stitched together, one slow and conventional, the other accelerated by fame in a way almost no other SS officer of comparable seniority experienced. His SS membership number was 295, 979, his Nazi party number, 1081, 671. Skorzeny's early war record is genuinely combat-tested, not manufactured. He served in the German invasions of the Netherlands and France in 1940, then in the Balkans campaign, before being sent east for Operation Barbarossa, the June 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union, attached to the SS Division Das Reich, one of the most heavily engaged formations of the entire Eastern Front campaign, and a unit whose casualty rates that first winter were brutal even by the standards of a war that killed millions of soldiers on both sides. During the Battle of Moscow in October 1941, Skorzeny was, by his own account, tasked with missions to seize key Soviet government buildings if the city fell, including the NKVD's Lubyanka headquarters and the sluice gates of the Moscow-Volga Canal, structures tied to a German plan to flood the Soviet capital rather than let it be recaptured intact. That plan mattered strategically, at least on paper. Flooding Moscow would have meant deliberately drowning a city of millions of civilians and soldiers alike, using captured Soviet infrastructure as the weapon. Those missions were scrapped when the German advance stalled outside Moscow that winter, as Soviet resistance, German supply line failures, and the onset of one of the harshest winters in decades combined to stop Army Group Center roughly 20 miles short of the Kremlin. This part of the story comes only from Skorzeny's own post-war memoirs. It should be treated as his personal account rather than independently confirmed history, since no outside record of the specific building seizure orders has surfaced. What is independently documented is that Skorzeny was awarded the Iron Cross Second Class for his service, and that in the winter of 1941 into 1942, he was hit in the back of the head by artillery shrapnel and evacuated from the front. It was during his convalescence in Berlin, recovering from a wound that could easily have killed him, that Skorzeny began developing his theories on unconventional and commando-style warfare, the ideas that would define the rest of his career. In April 1943, Skorzeny's name reached the desk of Ernst Kaltenbrunner, a fellow Austrian who had just taken over the RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office, the umbrella organization that controlled the SS intelligence and security services. Kaltenbrunner put Skorzeny forward for a new assignment, and Skorzeny was brought in to meet Walter Schellenberg, the head of AMT-6, the SS Foreign Intelligence Branch. The RSHA itself matters as more than just an org chart entry, because it explains exactly why a wounded infantry officer with an engineering degree ended up running Nazi Germany's commando program instead of a career special forces soldier. The RSHA had consolidated the Gestapo, the SD Security Service, and the criminal police under a single security apparatus by the early 1940s, and it functioned less like a single coherent institution and more like a set of competing internal fiefdoms, each headed by an ambitious officer angling for Himmler's favor. Kaltenbrunner's recommendation of a fellow Austrian wasn't purely a professional judgment about Skorzeny's military talent, it was also, in the internal politics of the RSHA, a move to place a personally loyal, personally connected officer into a newly created and potentially high-visibility command. The result was a promotion into an entirely new kind of role. AMT-6, the branch Schellenberg ran, was the SS answer to a foreign intelligence service, distinct from the Gestapo's domestic security work, and by 1943, Schellenberg was pushing to build out a paramilitary sabotage capability to sit alongside his intelligence-gathering apparatus. Skorzeny, a combat-tested but not especially senior SS officer with an engineering background and a growing reputation for resourcefulness, was exactly the kind of unconventional pick that role called for. He was given command of the SS Sabotage, Commando, and Espionage training schools, and put in charge of a unit called the Waffen-SS Sonderverben zur besonderen Verwendung Friedenthal, Special Purpose Forces, later renamed SS Jagdverband 502, and by November 1944 expanded into a full 5-battalion formation, the SS Jagdverband. In the space of a few months, Otto Skorzeny had gone from a wounded infantry officer recovering in a Berlin hospital bed to the man running Nazi Germany's newest experiment in unconventional warfare. Adolf Hitler had a specific reason for wanting a unit like this in the summer of 1943, and it had nothing to do with the Eastern Front. On July 25, 1943, the Fascist Grand Council in Rome had voted to depose Benito Mussolini, and King Victor Emmanuel III immediately had him arrested. For Hitler, this was a strategic emergency. Italy was Germany's principal European ally, and Mussolini's fall threatened to knock the country out of the Axis entirely. Hitler wanted Mussolini found and rescued, and the man he chose to help make that happen, at least according to the story Germany told the world, was Otto Skorzeny. Locating Mussolini took weeks. The Italian government moved him repeatedly to prevent a rescue, first to the island of Ponza, then to La Maddalena off Sardinia, then to a mainland site near Lake Bracciano, before finally settling him at the Hotel Campo Imperatore, a ski resort perched high in the Gran Sasso Massif of the Apennine Mountains, reachable only by a cable car the Italians could simply shut down. SS intelligence officer Herbert Kappler, running an informant network in Rome funded in part with counterfeit British banknotes worth a face value of £100,000, forged under a separate German operation and laundered through Kappler's Rome contacts to buy information without directly implicating German intelligence funds, was central to piecing together Mussolini's location through captured Italian communications in human sources. It's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular telling of Gran Sasso, but the raid that made Otto Skorzeny world famous was only possible because of weeks of unglamorous signals intelligence and paid informants working in Rome, coordinated by a different SS officer entirely, before a single glider ever left the ground. On September 12, 1943, the rescue operation launched. Roughly 90 German soldiers were involved in total. 10 DFS-230 gliders, each carrying 9 soldiers and a pilot, took off from Pratica di Mare Air Base near Rome between 1:05 and 1:10 in the afternoon. Skorzeny personally led 16 SS troopers who had been folded into what was, in scale and command structure, primarily a Luftwaffe paratrooper operation. Only one glider crashed on landing, causing minor injuries. Mussolini's guard at the hotel numbered roughly 200 Italian carabinieri, and they surrendered without firing a shot. An Italian general, Fernando Soliti, had been brought along on the raid specifically to order the guards to stand down, and they did. Mussolini was flown out on a small Fieseler Storch aircraft piloted by Heinrich Gerlach, and within hours he was standing in front of Adolf Hitler. Even a detail as basic as how high up that hotel actually sat has drifted across retellings. A 1948 magazine account of the raid gave an elevation figure for Campo Imperatore that doesn't match the mountain's actual height. An early example of how quickly small factual errors calcified into the accepted version of the Skorzeny story once the press got hold of it in the 1940s and simply kept repeating each other. It remains one of the most famous special operations raids of the Second World War. It also, according to the historians who have gone back through the German military's own planning records, was not Skorzeny's operation to begin with. Here is the mainstream version almost every documentary repeats. Otto Skorzeny planned and led the daring glider raid that snatched Mussolini out from under the Italians' noses. Here is what the paper trail actually shows. The raid was ordered personally by Hitler and approved by General Kurt Student, the German airborne commander. But the man who planned the attack, selected the paratroopers, and commanded the 2nd Assault Group on the ground was a Luftwaffe officer named Major Harold Moors. Research from the Swiss National Museum, examining the operational records, concludes that Skorzeny's role in the actual raid seems to have been a subordinate one at best. Skorzeny was not even supposed to be first through the door. He had pushed his own glider to skip part of the planned descent pattern specifically so he would land ahead of the others and reach Mussolini first, positioning himself for the cameras that Joseph Goebbels's propaganda ministry had arranged to be present. And that's the second half of the contrarian case. This was, by design, a propaganda operation as much as a military one. The German government, specifically Heinrich Himmler and Goebbels, took a raid Harold Moores had planned and handed all of the public credit to Otto Skorzeny, because the SS needed a hero, and Skorzeny, tall, scarred, and camera-ready, fit the part. It was, in the words of the Swiss National Museum's own historical analysis, a classic piece of propaganda to make the SS look good in the press. None of this erases the fact that Skorzeny was physically present, genuinely at risk, and did help identify the landing approach. The debate isn't about his courage. It's about who actually gets the credit for the plan, and for 80 years, the wrong man's name has been on it. Think about what that actually required, logistically, in September 1943. Goebbels's propaganda ministry didn't stumble onto a hero after the fact. Cameras and photographers were arranged in advance to capture Skorzeny specifically, which means the decision to elevate him over Major Moores was made before the raid even happened, not afterward, based on who performed best on the day. The propaganda outcome was, in other words, planned alongside the raid itself, which makes Gran Sasso less a case of a media circus growing organically around a genuine hero and more a case of a media strategy that was baked into the operational plan from the very beginning. The line Skorzeny reportedly delivered to Mussolini on the mountaintop, some version of Duce, "The Führer has sent me to set you free," comes down to us mainly through Skorzeny's own retelling in a 1948 magazine account, so the exact wording shouldn't be treated as a verified quotation. What's not in dispute is what happened next. Hitler, thrilled at the propaganda win, told Skorzeny he had performed a military feat which will become part of history, awarded him the Knight's Cross on September 13, and promoted him to SS Sturmbannführer, the equivalent of major. Otto Skorzeny, a mid-level SS officer nobody outside German military circles had heard of 2 weeks earlier, was now internationally famous, and every later chapter of his career, right up through his death in 1975, was shaped by that single burst of manufactured celebrity. Gran Sasso's success attracted rumor and speculation the way a bright light attracts moths, and separating what Skorzeny actually did from what got attached to his name afterward is its own historical exercise. He was linked to a failed May 1944 mission, codenamed Operation Rosselsprung, Knight's Leap, aimed at capturing the Yugoslav partisan leader Tito, which failed. He was rumored to have plotted to kidnap French General Charles de Gaulle. And a supposed German plan to assassinate Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin at the November 1943 Tehran Conference, sometimes called Operation Long Jump in later retellings, has also been tied to his name. Skorzeny himself always denied the Tehran assassination plot existed at all, and most historians treat it as Soviet wartime propaganda rather than a real German operation. The supposed source who claimed to have leaked German plans to Soviet intelligence appears, by Skorzeny's own account, to have been fictional. That detail matters. Even the man whose entire fame rested on self-mythologizing pushed back on this particular legend, and that tells you how far the Skorzeny story had already drifted from anything resembling a verified record by the middle of the war. There's a useful pattern to notice across all four of these rumored operations: Tito, de Gaulle, Tehran, and the genuine Gran Sasso raid that started the whole cycle. Once Goebbels's propaganda apparatus had successfully attached Skorzeny's name to one spectacular, high-stakes special operation, it became almost automatic for rumor, wartime intelligence speculation, and post-war journalism alike to attach his name to every other spectacular operation that came along, whether or not he had any actual connection to it. Fame, once it reaches a certain threshold, starts attracting stories rather than requiring them, a pattern that applied to Otto Skorzeny in 1940 for the same way it applies to any sufficiently famous public figure today, in any field. Whenever something dramatic happens and audiences go looking for a name to attach to it. On July 20, 1944, a group of German army officers led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler with a briefcase bomb at his Wolf's Lair headquarters and seize control of the government in Berlin. The plotters believed, correctly as it turned out, that the war was already lost, and hoped that killing Hitler and rapidly seizing control of Berlin's military and communications infrastructure could allow Germany to negotiate an end to the war before the country was completely destroyed. The plot failed, Hitler survived with relatively minor injuries, and in the chaotic hours afterward, as conspirators in Berlin scrambled to determine whether the assassination had actually succeeded, Skorzeny was involved in helping suppress the plot's aftermath in the capital, moving to secure key installations and reassert loyalist SS control while the situation in Berlin remained genuinely uncertain for several hours. Much of the detail of exactly what he did that night again traces primarily back to his own post-war account, so treat the specifics with some caution, but his general presence and role in the post-coup crackdown in Berlin is corroborated by outside sources. The broader crackdown that followed July 20 was brutal and far-reaching. Thousands of people, including many who had only tangential connections to the plot, were arrested, and roughly 200 were executed, and Skorzeny's participation, whatever its exact scope, places him inside one of the most consequential and violent episodes of internal Nazi political repression during the entire war. In the aftermath of the failed coup, Skorzeny reportedly reflected on his own sense of personal obligation to Hitler in terms that reveal something about how he sought his own loyalty. He framed his commitment as a pledge tied specifically to Hitler as an individual, not to the abstract idea of Germany or National Socialism as a system, a framing that, whether or not the exact quotation is verbatim, matches the way he conducted himself for the rest of the war and the rest of his life. He never publicly renounced Nazism, not in 1945, not in 1975. Before going further into the war record, the epithet that gives this video its title deserves a closer look, because "the most dangerous man in Europe" is one of the most widely repeated lines about Otto Skorzeny, and one of the hardest to trace to an actual, verifiable source. Popular retellings routinely credit the phrase to the Allies broadly, and some accounts go further and attribute it directly to Winston Churchill or, in a handful of pop history sources, mistakenly to Adolf Hitler himself. The most specific sourced attribution available places the phrase with American and British military intelligence more broadly. Journalists Dan Raviv and Yossi Melman, in their 2016 reporting for The Forward, wrote that American and British military intelligence had labeled Skorzeny the most dangerous man in Europe. But even that framing is a journalistic characterization of a general intelligence community reputation, not a documented quotation from a specific, named wartime official on a specific date. British author Charles Whiting's 1972 biography of Skorzeny, simply titled Skorzeny, is generally credited with cementing the phrase as Skorzeny's enduring public nickname, meaning the title that defines how most people remember him may owe more to a 1970s book jacket than to any wartime intelligence document that has actually surfaced. Whiting's book jacket separately claims that Dwight Eisenhower himself had declared Skorzeny the most wanted man in Europe, a related but distinct claim, and one that likewise lacks a clearly documented primary source. None of this means the underlying sentiment was wrong. Allied intelligence services clearly did take Skorzeny seriously as a threat. The Eisenhower assassination scare during the Battle of the Bulge is proof enough of that on its own. But the precise, quotable phrase that's followed him through 50 years of book titles, documentary titles, and now this video's own title, appears to be less a documented wartime assessment and more a piece of post-war branding, one more instance, fittingly, of the Skorzeny legend growing a little larger with each retelling. There's something almost self-referential about that, a video built around debunking the manufactured parts of a legend, using that legend's own most famous nickname as its title, because that's still the phrase most likely to make someone stop scrolling and start watching. The propaganda machine, in other words, is still doing its job, just for a different audience, on a different platform, 50 years after the man it was built around is dead. The same caution applies to several of the specific lines most commonly attributed to Skorzeny and to Hitler around the Gran Sasso raid. The line Skorzeny is said to have delivered to Mussolini on the mountaintop, "Some version of the Führer has sent me to set you free," varies in exact wording across different retellings and traces mainly to Skorzeny's own account in a 1948 magazine report, not a contemporaneous transcript. Hitler's reported response, praising Skorzeny for a military feat which will become part of history and for giving him back his friend Mussolini, is widely quoted across decades of books and documentaries, but, like so much of this story, deserves to be treated as a widely attributed line rather than a verified transcript. Even Winston Churchill's reported description of the raid as a feat of great daring carries the same caveat, extremely widely repeated, but with wording and precise sourcing that shift depending on which retelling you're reading. By October 1944, Hungary had become a problem for Germany. Admiral Miklos Horthy, Hungary's regent and effectively its head of state, was secretly negotiating an armistice with the advancing Soviet army, hoping to pull Hungary out of the war before the Red Army overran the country entirely. Hitler could not allow one of Germany's last remaining European allies to defect. Hungary sat directly astride the southern approach to Austria and, beyond that, to the German heartland itself, and losing Hungarian territory and Hungarian troops to a separate peace would have collapsed an entire section of Germany's crumbling eastern defensive line months before it actually happened. The solution, once again, involved Otto Skorzeny. On October 15, 1944, Skorzeny executed Operation Panzerfaust. His deputy, Adrian von Fockersam, a veteran of the Brandenburg Division, Germany's other elite special operations formation, helped run the operation, which began with the kidnapping of Horthy's son, Miklos Horthy Jr., who was seized and later sent to the Mauthausen concentration camp as leverage against his father. German forces, including 4 Tiger II heavy tanks, then moved on Buda Castle on Castle Hill in Budapest to secure the seat of Hungarian government. Facing the loss of his son and the occupation of his capital, Horthy was forced to abdicate, and the Germans installed Ferenc Selassie, the leader of the fascist Arrow Cross Party, as a puppet ruler loyal to Berlin. German plenipotentiary Edmund Wiesenmayer oversaw the broader political operation on Germany's behalf. Operation Panzerfaust was, unlike Gran Sasso, a mission Skorzeny appears to have genuinely planned and led with real operational skill, a hostage-taking and coup operation executed with minimal bloodshed that achieved its strategic objective completely. Compare the two operations directly. At Gran Sasso, Skorzeny arrived to execute a plan built primarily by Major Harold Moors. In Hungary, the planning, the hostage-taking of Horthy's son, and the armored move on Buda Castle all sit far more clearly within Skorzeny's own command structure, run alongside a genuinely elite deputy in Adrian von Fockersam, himself a veteran of the Brandenburg Division, Germany's other special forces formation, and in some respects a more operationally sophisticated one than Skorzeny's own SS unit. The operation earned him a further promotion, to SS Obersturmbannführer, Lieutenant Colonel, on October 16, 1944. If Gran Sasso is the mission that made Skorzeny's public reputation, Panzerfaust may be the mission that most legitimately earned it, a genuinely well-executed coup that removed a head of state from power and installed a German-aligned government in under 24 hours, with a fraction of the bloodshed a direct military assault on Budapest would have required. 2 months later, Skorzeny was handed his largest and most notorious operation of the war. On December 16, 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge, an attempt to punch through thin American lines in the Ardennes forest, split the Allied armies, and retake the port of Antwerp. As part of the offensive, Skorzeny was ordered to form and command Panzer Brigade 150, under the codename Operation Greif, a unit designed to infiltrate American lines disguised as US soldiers, seize key bridges over the Meuse River, and sow confusion behind Allied lines. The National World War II Museum's own account of the operation, drawn from American after-action records and photographs of the captured infiltrators, remains one of the most detailed English-language institutional sources on exactly how the operation unfolded and how quickly American forces adapted once they realized what Skorzeny's men were attempting. The numbers behind Operation Greif tell a story most retellings skip entirely. Skorzeny had requested 300 men for the brigade. He received roughly 500, assembled at the Greifenwehr training grounds, 800 men short of what he'd asked for. Within that force, an elite English-speaking commando subunit called Einheitsstila numbered around 150 men, trained to operate behind American lines in U.S. uniforms. Equipment fell even further short than manpower had. Skorzeny had requested 20 American Sherman tanks, 30 armored cars, 100 jeeps, and roughly 200 trucks. What he actually received was closer to 2 Shermans, one of which broke down before the operation even began, around 4 scout cars, about 30 jeeps, and 15 trucks. To fill the gap, German Panther tanks were crudely disguised with sheet metal to resemble American M10 tank destroyers. Casualties in the operation ran roughly 15% for the brigade, and of the roughly 44 men sent behind American lines in disguise, about 8 were lost. Put those numbers side by side and the picture that emerges is almost the opposite of the popular image of Operation Greif as a slick, well-resourced infiltration operation. Skorzeny was handed roughly 76% of the manpower he'd asked for, and by some counts as little as 10% of the vehicles and armor, and he was still ordered to execute a mission that depended on his disguised force looking convincingly American to enemy soldiers at close range, in daylight, under combat conditions. The gap between what the operation needed to succeed and what Nazi Germany's collapsing wartime economy could actually deliver by December 1944 tells you as much about the state of the German war machine in its final winter as it does about Skorzeny's own planning. The men in American uniforms were trained on details meant to let them blend in without drawing notice: American slang, baseball statistics, the names of celebrities' spouses, state capitals. It wasn't always enough. Some infiltrators were caught partly because of small, almost absurd giveaways, driving 4 men to a jeep, for instance, when American units typically rode 2. 3 of the captured infiltrators, Gunther Billing, Manfred Pernis, and Wilhelm Schmidt, were executed by an American firing squad on December 23, 1944, under the laws of war governing soldiers caught fighting out of the uniform of their own country. That detail matters more than it might first appear, because it's the exact legal question, infiltration and combat in an enemy uniform, that would put Skorzeny himself on trial less than 3 years later, at Dachau, for ordering the operation that got these 3 men killed. The men who died on December 23 were executed under the same legal principle Skorzeny would later be acquitted of violating, a genuinely uncomfortable asymmetry that sits at the center of the entire Dachau case. The soldiers following Skorzeny's orders paid with their lives for the tactic, while the officer who designed and ordered it walked free. Panzer Brigade 150's main combat assault, aimed at Malmedy, was repulsed on December 21. There's a modern parallel buried in the failure of Operation Greif that's worth pulling out explicitly, because it's not really a story about tanks, it's a supply chain story. Skorzeny asked for a specific inventory of equipment and received roughly a tenth of the vehicles and armor he requested, then had to improvise with disguised substitutes that fooled almost no one up close. That's not a uniquely 1944 problem. It's the same failure mode that hits modern companies when a procurement plan on paper collides with what a supply chain can actually deliver on time. The gap between the requisition and the delivery truck is where operations, whether they're military campaigns or product launches, quietly die. Operation Greif's disguised Panthers, welded together to vaguely resemble American armor because the real American armor never showed up, are a 70-year-old case study in the exact problem modern logistics software exists to solve. The most consequential thing to come out of Operation Greif, though, wasn't the fighting at all, it was a rumor. Skorzeny deliberately let word spread, even among some of his own men, that the brigade's real mission was to send a small team to assassinate General Dwight Eisenhower in Paris. Captured infiltrators, under interrogation, appeared to confirm a plot that historians believe never actually existed as a formal operation. The Americans took the threats seriously regardless. Eisenhower was placed under tight protective security through the Christmas holiday, and a lieutenant colonel who resembled him, Baldwin B. Smith, was used as a decoy, riding in his staff car to draw attention. Skorzeny denied for the rest of his life that an Eisenhower assassination plot had ever formally existed. Sit with the actual mechanics of what happened here for a second, because it's a genuinely elegant piece of information warfare. Skorzeny never needed his infiltrators to succeed at killing anyone. He needed a handful of them to get captured while appearing to believe, sincerely, that assassination was the goal, soldiers who would tell their interrogators exactly what they'd been led to think was true, because they weren't lying, they were simply misinformed by their own commander. That's a rumor engineered to survive interrogation, because the men repeating it under pressure genuinely didn't know it wasn't real. Whether the rumor was a deliberate piece of psychological warfare from the start or simply spun out of control on its own and Skorzeny let it run, it worked exactly like one, an entire Allied command structure disrupted for days, a 5-star general confined and shadowed by a body double, over a threat that may never have existed as a formal military order at all. By January 1945, the war on the Eastern Front had turned into a desperate defensive fight to keep the Red Army out of the German heartland. Skorzeny was given command of a defensive position at Schwedt, on the Oder River, holding a bridgehead against the advancing Soviet Second Belarusian Front with a force of roughly 4,000 to 5,000 troops, acting in the role of a major general despite his formal SS rank. He held the position for approximately 31 days, from late January into early March 1945, before handing over command to SS Obersturmbannführer Hans Kempen on February 26 and moving on to his next assignment. The Schwedt bridgehead assignment is, in its own quiet way, one of the more genuinely impressive entries on Skorzeny's record, and one of the least discussed. By January 1945, the war on the Eastern Front had turned into a rout in most sectors, with German formations collapsing or retreating in disarray ahead of an overwhelming Soviet numerical advantage. Skorzeny took an improvised force, not a veteran, cohesive division, but roughly 4,000 to 5,000 troops assembled specifically for this defensive stand, and held a fixed position on the Oder River for a full month against one of the Red Army's major fronts. That's not a commando raid or a hostage operation, it's conventional defensive warfare, the least glamorous and arguably most demanding kind of soldiering there is, and Skorzeny appears to have handled it competently enough to hold the line for 31 days before an orderly handover of command. In March, with American forces having seized the Rhine Bridge at Remagen intact, one of the war's decisive strokes of Allied luck, and a crossing German high command had assumed would be destroyed before it could be used, Skorzeny was ordered to organize a naval demolition attempt to destroy the bridge and deny it to the Allies. The attempt failed. American engineers had already reinforced the crossing, and by that point in the war, Germany's ability to mount serious counter-demolition operations against a fully secured Allied bridgehead was essentially gone. On April 9, 1945, with the war weeks from its end, Skorzeny received the Oak Leaves to his Knight's Cross, becoming the 826th German soldier to receive that decoration, and was promoted to SS Standartenführer, Colonel, the final rank he would hold, awarded for a war that had, by that point, only 3 weeks left to run. Photographs from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's archive show Otto Skorzeny standing at the Nuremberg witness stand in November 1945, still denying an assassination plot against Eisenhower months after the war had ended. That's where the war ends for Otto Skorzeny. On May 15 or 16, 1945, days after Germany's surrender, Skorzeny walked toward American lines near Salzburg, Austria, and surrendered to the U.S. 30th Infantry Regiment, not in hiding, not under a false name, but as himself. He understood something that would define the rest of his life, that his own fame, manufactured or not, was a form of protection. A famous prisoner is a valuable prisoner, not a disposable one. The U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum's photographic archive preserves images of Skorzeny from November 1945, held in the witness wing of the Nuremberg jail, not as a defendant in the main international military tribunal proceedings against Germany's top leadership, but as a witness and a subject of ongoing American interest, still being questioned about the Eisenhower rumor months after the war had ended and denying, as he would for the rest of his life, that any formal assassination plot had ever existed. It's a strange image to sit with, the most famous commando of the Second World War, held not as a convicted war criminal but essentially as a person of continuing interest, in the same complex where the surviving architects of the Nazi state were being tried for their lives. Skorzeny's wartime legal jeopardy centered on Operation Greif, specifically, the question of whether ordering German soldiers to fight in American uniforms violated the laws of war. He was tried at Dachau, in a U.S. military tribunal, from August 18 to September 9, 1947, alongside 9 co-defendants. The defense's most consequential witness was not German. Forrest Frederick Edward Yeo Thomas, a British Special Operations Executive Officer known as the White Rabbit for his exploits evading capture in occupied France, testified that Allied commandos, including British operatives, had themselves fought in German uniforms during the war, establishing that Skorzeny's forces were not doing anything the Allies hadn't also done. Reporting from the period also places 2 other prominent American figures connected to the case in some capacity, General Omar Bradley, by deposition, and OSS Chief William Donovan, though these secondary appearances receive far less attention than Yeo Thomas's dramatic first-hand testimony. Skorzeny was also cleared of any connection to the December 1944 Malmedy massacre, a mass killing of American prisoners of war carried out during the Battle of the Bulge, after SS officer Joachim Paper testified that Skorzeny had nothing to do with those killings. On September 9, 1947, the tribunal acquitted Skorzeny and all 9 co-defendants. The court gave no formal written reasoning for the verdict, which has left some legal historians to debate exactly which argument carried the day, whether it was Yeo Thomas's precedent-setting testimony, insufficient proof that Skorzeny personally ordered combat in American uniforms rather than just infiltration in them, or a broader reluctance by the tribunal to be seen delivering what critics call seizure justice, victor's justice, applying different standards to the losing side than the winning one had followed itself. What's notable is that Otto Thomas's testimony, despite functioning as the case's dramatic centerpiece in nearly every retelling since, goes essentially unmentioned in the surviving judge-advocate review documents from the case, a gap between the courtroom drama and the paper trail that historians examining the acquittal have flagged without fully resolving. The Dachau acquittal deserves more attention than a single courtroom outcome usually gets, because the legal question at its center didn't disappear with Otto Skorzeny in September 1947, and it's a question that has continued to matter in every conflict since. The core issue came down to a sharp legal distinction: whether infiltrating enemy lines while wearing the enemy's own uniform counted as a war crime on its own, or whether the crime only occurred if a soldier actually fought and killed while still wearing that uniform. Skorzeny's men had done the former extensively and, in some contested instances, arguably the latter. Otto Thomas's testimony that British and Allied Special Operations Forces had used the exact same infiltration technique against Germany forced the tribunal to confront an uncomfortable symmetry, since punishing Skorzeny's men for a tactic Allied forces had also used would have meant applying one legal standard to the losing side of the war and a different, more forgiving standard to the winning side. That's the heart of the seizure justice critique that's followed the case ever since, not necessarily that Skorzeny was innocent of everything he was accused of, but that the underlying legal principle needed to apply symmetrically, or it wasn't really a legal principle at all, just victor's justice dressed up in courtroom procedure. The Dachau Tribunal's decision to acquit, whatever its precise internal reasoning, ended up functioning as an early and influential precedent on exactly this question, one that later shaped how international law came to treat the use of enemy uniforms in combat operations more broadly. This makes the Skorzeny case unusual within the broader field of post-war war crimes trials. The Nuremberg trials and the many subsequent proceedings against former Nazi officials generally turned on questions of atrocity, extermination, and the systematic abuse of civilians and prisoners, clear-cut moral and legal territory by any standard. Skorzeny's case turned instead on a genuinely contested, symmetrical question of battlefield tactics that both sides had used, which is part of why it's remained a case legal scholars still cite decades later, long after most of the era's individual war crimes verdicts have faded from public memory. Otto Skorzeny, a man who spent most of his life avoiding responsibility for anything, ended up at the center of a legal precedent that had nothing to do with his own reputation and everything to do with a genuinely difficult question about the rules of war. Acquittal did not mean freedom. Skorzeny remained in an internment camp at Darmstadt, held on suspicion of continued denazification proceedings even after his war crimes acquittal. On July 27, 1948, he escaped. The most persistent story, repeated in numerous accounts of his life, holds that 3 of his own former SS comrades, disguised as US military policemen, walked into the camp and simply signed him out, driving him off the base in broad daylight before anyone realized what had happened. There's an obvious symmetry worth noticing here. The same man who built Operation Greif around German soldiers disguised in American uniforms walked free from an American internment camp 2.5 years later using, according to the most commonly repeated account of his escape, essentially the identical trick, impersonation of the occupying power's own personnel, executed with enough confidence that nobody stopped to check. From there, he hid for a period on a farm in Bavaria, then moved through Salzburg, before surfacing in Paris, living, for roughly 2 years, as a wanted man inside occupied and immediate post-war Europe without being caught. On February 13, 1950, a French photographer caught him at a café on the Champs-Élysées. The photo ran in the press the following day, confirming to the world that the most famous commando of the Second World War was alive, free, and apparently unconcerned about being seen. It's a small, telling detail about Skorzeny's psychology. A genuinely hunted fugitive does not sit at an outdoor café on one of the most photographed streets in Europe. Whether that was recklessness, arrogance, or simply Skorzeny's continuing instinct that his own fame made him harder to touch, the Paris café photograph reads today less like a fugitive caught by accident and more like a man who had stopped being especially careful. Later that year, on September 16, 1950, Skorzeny crossed into Spain, entering under a false identity, the alias Rolf Steinbauer, and beginning the final and, in some ways, strangest chapter of his life. Franco's Spain in 1950 sat at the intersection of several currents that mattered enormously to a man like Skorzeny, a fascist-adjacent government that had never fully purged its wartime sympathies, a growing community of former Nazi and Axis figures who had relocated there after the war, and, increasingly, as the decade wore on, the early architecture of Cold War intelligence gathering, with American, British, Israeli, and Soviet services all trying to figure out what the continent's surviving fascist networks knew and who they still talked to. Skorzeny didn't just hide in Spain. He became, for 2.5 decades, a fixture of exactly that intersection. In Spain, Skorzeny built a public identity as a businessman, formally denazified in absentia by a West German arbitration board in 1952, a bureaucratic process that, on paper, cleared him of the political disqualifications that had followed former Nazi party members into the post-war era, while doing nothing to address the war crimes questions Dachau had already resolved separately 5 years earlier. Denazification and war crimes liability were, technically, two entirely different legal processes, and Skorzeny had now formally cleared both, acquitted at Dachau in 1947, denazified by the German board in 1952, without ever spending a single day in prison for either. He ran engineering and business ventures out of Madrid, trading, at least publicly, on the same engineering training he'd received decades earlier at the Technical University of Vienna, before any of this started, and the historical record on how genuine those businesses actually were is mixed. At least one CIA document assessing his commercial activity concluded, in the analyst's own words, "I do not think this is a front," a fairly direct statement that his engineering business appeared to be a real operation, not simply cover for something else. Other intelligence reports from the same period characterized his business dealings as at least partly a cover. Both assessments exist in the declassified record, and neither fully resolves the question. He also, during this period, bought property outside Spain, a farm of roughly 165 to 200 acres, sources vary, called Martinstown House in County Kildare, Ireland, purchased in 1959 and sold in 1971. He was received at a 1957 Dublin function attended by Charles Haughey, who would later become Ireland's Taoiseach, its head of government. But Irish military intelligence, known as G2, monitored him closely, and Irish authorities ultimately refused to grant him a residency visa, limiting him to stays of roughly 6 weeks at a time, a small but telling data point, because it shows that even a country with no direct stake in Germany's wartime conduct treated Skorzeny as a security concern worth actively tracking, not simply a retired soldier enjoying a rural Irish farm. In 1953, Skorzeny was sent to Egypt as a military advisor, reportedly dispatched at least in part through connections to Reinhard Gehlen, the former Wehrmacht intelligence chief who, after the war, built and ran what became known as the Gehlen Organization, an intelligence apparatus that worked indirectly with, and was eventually absorbed into, the American Central Intelligence Agency. Gehlen's own post-war trajectory is, in miniature, the same story playing out across an entire generation of former German officers, men whose expertise, contacts, and networks in the East were suddenly valuable to Western intelligence services building Cold War operations against the Soviet Union, regardless of what those same men had done during the war itself. Skorzeny's recruitment into an Egypt advisory role fits that broader pattern precisely, a former SS officer's usefulness measured purely in terms of Cold War strategic advantage, divorced almost entirely from his wartime record. Skorzeny's advisory work in Egypt put him in contact with General Mohammed Naguib and, in the years following, the rising Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser, at a moment when Egypt's military was actively rebuilding and modernizing in the aftermath of the 1952 revolution that had overthrown the Egyptian monarchy, precisely the kind of environment where a foreign military advisor with real special operations and unconventional warfare experience, regardless of his past, could find steady, compensated work. Skorzeny's Spanish decades weren't spent purely on business and quiet advisory trips, either. In 1970, near Alicante on Spain's southeastern coast, a group called the Paladin Group was founded, a private security and mercenary recruitment operation with which Skorzeny was associated, run day-to-day by a man named Gerhard Hartmut von Schubert and involving, among others, a former American colonel named James Sanders. 6 years earlier, in 1966, Skorzeny had also been a founding figure in SEDADE, a Spanish neo-fascist organization whose name translates roughly to the Spanish Circle of Friends of Europe, an organization that, decades after the war's end, continued promoting the same political currents Skorzeny had joined as a young man in Vienna in 1932. Taken together, the Paladin Group and SEDADE make clear that Skorzeny's post-war life in Spain was never simply a quiet retirement. He remained, right through the 1970s, an organizer and a connector inside Europe's surviving far-right and mercenary networks, even if, as the historical record on Odessa and Die-Spin shows, the scale of his actual operational reach was consistently smaller than his reputation implied. It's a useful detail to hold on to heading into his final years. Whatever else is disputed about Otto Skorzeny's post-war life, his continued, active political engagement with far-right organizing, not passive nostalgia, but founding memberships in active organizations, is not one of the disputed parts. Franco's Spain gave him 3 decades to build exactly that kind of network in the open, with functionally no legal consequence. No part of the Skorzeny story has generated more speculation, more paperback thrillers, and more historically unsupported claims than the idea that he ran a vast, coordinated escape network smuggling fugitive Nazis out of Europe after the war, commonly referred to under 2 names, Odessa and Die-Spin, the Spider. It helps to understand the environment this legend grew out of before getting into the specific claims about Skorzeny's role in it. In the years immediately after Germany's surrender, thousands of former Nazi Party members, SS officers, and collaborators genuinely did leave Europe, using a patchwork of individual contacts, sympathetic clergy, forged travel documents, and destination countries, chiefly Perón's Argentina, but also Paraguay, Chile, Bolivia, and parts of the Middle East, willing to accept them with minimal questions asked. That much is well documented and not in dispute among historians. The dispute that matters for Skorzeny's story specifically is whether the genuine, real phenomenon of individual and small group escapes was ever centrally organized under a single command structure, run by identifiable leaders, functioning something like an underground railroad with Otto Skorzeny at its head, the version of events that made for such compelling Cold War-era thriller fiction, and that Skorzeny himself, whether directly or through the reputation he cultivated, appears to have done little to discourage. The popular version of this story, repeated across decades of pulp history books and thriller novels, holds that Skorzeny personally organized and ran a sophisticated underground railroad that moved as many as 600 former SS men out of Europe to safe havens in Spain, Argentina, Paraguay, Chile, Bolivia, and the Middle East. That 600 figure comes from a single 1981 book, Glenn Infield's The Secrets of the SS, and it has never been independently corroborated by any other source. Historians who have gone looking for the organizational infrastructure this claim implies have not found it. British investigative historian Guy Walters, in his 2009 book Hunting Evil, found no evidence that Odessa existed as any kind of centralized network at all, and argued bluntly that Skorzeny was neither intelligent nor discreet enough to manage a clandestine escape network, that his name was used for prestige and reputation while American intelligence was, in fact, monitoring his movements the entire time. German historian Daniel Stahl's 2011 research reached the same basic conclusion. The historical consensus is that no single organization called Odessa ever existed as a unified body. The most authoritative source on this question is a U.S. government-commissioned history. The Interagency Working Group, staffed by professional historians including Richard Brightman and Norman Goda and drawing on declassified American intelligence files, published their findings in a 2010 study called Hitler's Shadow. Their verdict on Die-Spin is direct: the spin is the stuff of legend. What Brightman and Goda actually found, digging through the real declassified paper trail, was something much smaller and much less cinematic: a 1949 association of Austrian Nazis pushing for the political rehabilitation of former Nazis inside Austria and for a renewed pan-German nationalist agenda, not an international smuggling operation moving hundreds of fugitives across oceans. None of this means nothing happened. Looser, less organized escape routes, sometimes called ratlins, genuinely did move some former Nazi and fascist figures out of Europe in the post-war years, using channels that ran through Spain, Italy, and sympathetic clergy, and landing many fugitives in Perón's Argentina. Skorzeny may well have played some role in helping individual former comrades relocate. The historical dispute isn't over whether any of that happened, it's over the scale, the organization, and the leadership. Treating Skorzeny as the architect of a 600-man smuggling empire is, according to the best available research, mythology that outgrew the man. And once again, that mythology serves Skorzeny's interests perfectly. An internationally feared master spy was a far more useful reputation to have in 1950s Madrid than an unemployed, denazified engineer with a war crimes trial on his record. A pattern emerges by this point in the story. Every major escalation of the Skorzeny legend, from Gran Sasso onward, happened to align precisely with what was useful to Otto Skorzeny at that specific moment: propaganda value for the Reich in 1943, and, a decade later, deterrent value for an aging exile who very much wanted potential enemies, journalists, and rival intelligence services to think twice before crossing him. The Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act eventually forced the declassification of the CIA's internal file on Skorzeny, and what it shows is considerably less dramatic than either his own mythology or later conspiracy writing suggests. Agency analysts tracked him as a low-priority subject of suspicion. One internal assessment described him as operationally quarantined, and another concluded he was probably being used as a channel for black propaganda, not employed as a formal, paid intelligence officer. Contact between Skorzeny and American intelligence appears, from the documented record, to have been episodic and informant-based rather than an ongoing employment relationship. The dated paper trail itself spans nearly 2 decades. Reports placing him in Madrid under his Rolf Steinbauer alias date to February 1951, roughly 6 months after he first crossed into Spain, and the file continues to generate status material as late as 1969, nearly the entirety of his Spanish exile, tracked, watched, and periodically reassessed by an agency that never seems to have fully decided what to do with him. And the file isn't even internally consistent about the one thing you'd expect it to be clearest on: whether his Madrid engineering business was real. One CIA document flatly states, in the analyst's own words, "I do not think this is a front, a direct assessment that the business was legitimate commercial activity." A separate report from elsewhere in the same file characterizes his business dealings as at least partially a cover story. 2 documents, written by the same agency, evaluating the same man, reaching different conclusions, which is, in its own way, the most honest summary available of how much American intelligence actually understood about Otto Skorzeny at any given point in his post-war life. In one specific instance recounted by CIA officer Miles Copeland in his own memoir, The Game Player, Skorzeny tipped off the CIA's Madrid station chief that Egypt was actively recruiting former German military officers, useful information, passed informally, from a man both watching and being watched. It's a small anecdote, but it captures the actual texture of Skorzeny's relationship with American intelligence better than any conspiracy theory does. Not a master spy running networks, but an aging exile occasionally trading gossip for goodwill with the agency that had a file open on him the entire time. Copeland's own career is a useful footnote here as well. As a longtime CIA officer with direct experience of Cold War intelligence work across the Middle East, his casual mention of Skorzeny as a source of useful gossip rather than a controlled or valued asset is a small but meaningful data point against the more dramatic post-war super spy version of the Skorzeny story, coming, as it does, from someone who was actually inside the agency doing the watching, rather than a journalist reconstructing the relationship decades later from second-hand accounts. The single most sensational claim about Skorzeny's post-war life didn't surface publicly until decades after his death, and it remains genuinely unresolved. By the early 1960s, Egypt was actively developing a domestic missile program, and Israeli intelligence had grown alarmed at reports that German scientists, some with prior experience on Nazi Germany's own wartime rocket programs, were being recruited to help build it. Mossad's response was a campaign of intimidation aimed at those scientists, an operation that became known as Operation Damocles, involving letter bombs, threatening visits, and, in at least one case, an outright disappearance. On September 11, 1962, a German rocket scientist named Heinz Krug, who worked for a Munich engineering firm called Intra involved in supplying missile technology to Egypt's weapons program, disappeared near Munich. He was never seen again. In March 2016, veteran intelligence journalists Dan Raviv and Yossi Melman published reporting, based on anonymous former Israeli Mossad officers, claiming that Israel's intelligence service had recruited Otto Skorzeny in 1962 as part of an operation, codenamed Operation Damocles, aimed at intimidating and disrupting the German scientists helping build Egypt's missile program. According to their sources, Skorzeny was not just an informant in this operation but the actual triggerman who shot and killed Heinz Krug. If accurate, the recruitment itself is a striking historical footnote on its own terms, an intelligence service representing the Jewish state, founded in the direct aftermath of the Holocaust, reportedly turning to a former SS colonel as an operational asset less than 2 decades after the war's end, a decision that would have been driven purely by Mossad's assessment of what Skorzeny could do, with no apparent moral hesitation about who he had been. A former senior Mossad officer, Rafi Eitan, known within the service by the nickname Mr. Kidnap for his role in operations like the capture of Adolf Eichmann, reportedly confirmed to the journalists, orally, that he had personally met and run Skorzeny as an asset. Here is the detail that almost never makes it into retellings of this story, and it changes everything about how confidently you can tell it. Less than 2 years after the Raviv and Melman reporting, in January 2018, the German magazine Der Spiegel published a competing account, drawing on separate research by journalist and historian Ronen Bergman. That account states that the order to kill Heinz Krug came directly from Isser Harel, the director of Mossad at the time, but that the actual shooting was carried out by a different Mossad operative entirely, not Skorzeny, and that Krug's body was subsequently dumped at sea from an Israeli Air Force plane. Bergman is, for context, one of the most respected investigative journalists working on Israeli intelligence history, and his reporting on Mossad operations has repeatedly drawn on primary sources and direct access to former officers that few other journalists in the field can match, which makes the direct contradiction between his account and the Raviv/Melman version particularly hard to simply wave away as one side being less credible than the other. Two credible, well-sourced accounts from experienced intelligence journalists, published less than 2 years apart, disagree on who actually pulled the trigger. Both rely heavily on anonymous former intelligence sources rather than documentary proof. As of this recording, the precise circumstances of Heinz Krug's death, including whether Otto Skorzeny personally killed him, remain genuinely unresolved in the historical and journalistic record. Any version of this story that presents Skorzeny as assassin as settled fact is skipping over a real and unresolved dispute among the people who've investigated it most closely. Here's why this particular case is so hard to pin down. The reason says something about the entire post-war half of Skorzeny's story. The reason says something about the entire post-war half of Skorzeny's story. Mossad, like most intelligence services, did not maintain a public record of its 1960s covert operations, and the people best positioned to know the truth about Heinz Krug's death, the operatives who were actually there, spent the following decades bound by official secrecy, only occasionally and informally sharing details with journalists years or decades after the fact, often without their names attached. Rafi Eitan's reported confirmation that he ran Skorzeny as an asset is one of the more concrete data points in the entire post-war Skorzeny file, precisely because it comes from a named, identifiable former intelligence chief rather than an anonymous source, but even that confirmation addresses the recruitment relationship, not definitively the question of who fired the shots that killed Krug. What both competing accounts agree on is the broader shape of the operation, that Mossad, worried about German scientists helping build Egyptian missile capability, ran an intimidation and disruption campaign in the early 1960s, and that Otto Skorzeny, 20 years removed from his SS career, running a business in Madrid, was somehow inside that operation. The disagreement is only about exactly how far inside. A handful of claims that circulate around Skorzeny's later life don't fit neatly into the verified categories above, and they're worth naming specifically as unresolved rather than quietly leaving them out, since they turn up often enough in other retellings of his story that their absence here would look like an oversight rather than a deliberate choice. One recurring claim holds that Skorzeny, during his advisory period in Egypt in the 1950s, personally trained a young Yasser Arafat and a cohort of Palestinian volunteers in guerrilla and commando tactics. This claim shows up across a number of popular accounts of his life, but it lacks the kind of independent documentary support that would let it be presented as established fact. It should be treated as an unverified claim, more likely an embellishment that grew out of Skorzeny's genuine, documented advisory presence in Egypt during that period than a separately confirmed historical event. It's an obvious extension of the broader pattern already established elsewhere in this video. A genuine, documented Skorzeny connection to a place or a period gets a dramatic, headline-friendly detail attached to it later, and the attached detail is what tends to survive in popular retellings, while the more mundane underlying fact, an aging former SS colonel doing paid consulting work for a foreign government, gets left out entirely. Similarly, while Skorzeny's connection to the Paladin group and Sedate in the 1960s and 70s is documented, the full extent of his operational involvement, how much day-to-day command he actually exercised versus how much his name was used, again, primarily for prestige and reputation, is harder to pin down with precision, and mirrors the exact same pattern already established with Odessa and Diespin, a real organization, a real Skorzeny connection, and a scale of personal involvement that's genuinely difficult to verify beyond the fact of his association. Interest in separating the real Otto Skorzeny from the manufactured one hasn't faded with time. If anything, it has intensified. Oscar Gonzalez Lopez's 2018 book, Freeing Mussolini, Dismantling the Skorzeny Myth and the Grand Sasso Raid, is dedicated specifically to unwinding the propaganda version of the 1943 rescue. Stuart Smith's 2018 biography, Otto Skorzeny, The Devil's Disciple, offers what's become one of the more balanced modern assessments, describing Skorzeny as brave and genuinely resourceful in combat, but also as, in Smith's own words, an egoist who stole other men's credit, an unrepentant Nazi who never once, across 3 post-war decades, denounced the ideology he'd served. Interestingly, Smith's research also argues that Skorzeny's commando doctrine had a longer institutional shadow than most people realize, drawing a direct line from his special operations methods to the planning lineage behind the 2011 U.S. Navy SEAL raid that killed Osama bin Laden, a claim about operational doctrine influence, not about Skorzeny's personal character, and a genuinely rare data point most retellings of his story never mention. Historian Danny Orbach, a Hebrew University scholar and former Israeli intelligence operative himself, published Fugitives, A History of Nazi Mercenaries During the Cold War in 2021, drawing on previously unopened Mossad files. Orbach's central argument reframes the entire post-war Skorzeny narrative. Western, Soviet, and Israeli intelligence services all badly overestimated the practical value of former Nazi operatives like Skorzeny during the Cold War. In Orbach's own phrasing, the intelligence world's fevered dreams about men like Skorzeny turned out to be more influential than the less sensational, often painfully prosaic truth. What makes Orbach's book particularly useful for separating fact from legend is his professional background. He approaches the declassified Mossad material not as an outside researcher piecing together fragments, but as someone who understands from first-hand experience how intelligence services actually generate, circulate, and sometimes believe their own exaggerated assessments of a target's importance. His broader argument is that men like Skorzeny occupied a strange, self-reinforcing position in Cold War intelligence circles, precisely because multiple agencies were watching him and taking him seriously. Each agency assumed the others knew something they didn't, which inflated his perceived value without any of them actually confirming what he could really do. It's a feedback loop of institutional paranoia, not a case of a genuinely powerful operator running circles around Western and Israeli intelligence, and it's a more mundane, more human explanation for Skorzeny's outsized post-war reputation than any of the individual spy stories attached to his name. Orbach's broader book covers dozens of former Nazi operatives beyond Skorzeny who found similar Cold War second acts, and one of his more striking observations is how ordinary Skorzeny's post-war trajectory actually was within that larger population, a former SS or Wehrmacht officer with technical skills and old contacts, quietly absorbed into new intelligence relationships that had far more to do with 1950s and 60s geopolitics than with anything resembling redemption or reckoning for wartime conduct. Skorzeny wasn't uniquely valuable to the intelligence services that circled him for 3 decades. He was, according to Orbach's research, simply the most famous example of a genuinely common Cold War pattern. Stuart Smith's 2018 biography reaches a broadly compatible conclusion from a different angle, focused more tightly on the military record itself rather than the intelligence community mythology. Smith's assessment, genuinely brave and resourceful in combat, but also an unrepentant Nazi who spent 30 years stealing credit that in several cases belonged to other men, is notable for refusing to fully embrace either the hagiographic version of Skorzeny that dominated popular history for decades, or a purely dismissive version that would deny he had any real military talent at all. Smith's Skorzeny is neither the invincible super commando of Cold War pulp paperbacks nor a pure fraud. He's a genuinely capable wartime officer whose real accomplishments got permanently entangled with a mythology he built, encouraged, and ultimately never corrected, right up until his death in 1975. That's arguably the most useful single framework for making sense of the entire 80-year Skorzeny story, across every section of this video. Not hero, not fraud, but a genuinely capable operator who discovered early, at Gran Sasso, watching Goebbels' propaganda machine turn a subordinate role into a legend, that the myth was more valuable than the reality, and who spent every year afterward, in war and in exile, protecting that discovery. There's something worth pulling out of Orbach's framing, because it maps onto a pattern that has nothing to do with the Cold War specifically. Intelligence agencies in the 1950s and 60s spent enormous resources chasing the idea of Otto Skorzeny, the master spy, the network architect, the man who could open doors across a hidden fascist underground, because that idea was more compelling than the mundane reality of an aging, denazified engineer running a Madrid business of uncertain legitimacy. That's not a uniquely Cold War failure mode. It's the same gap that shows up whenever an institution, a government agency, a company doing competitive intelligence, even a modern social media platform trying to model who its most influential users are, mistakes a reputation for a resource. Skorzeny's post-war decades are, in a strange way, a case study in how mythology, once it's loud enough, can outcompete accuracy even inside the professional institutions whose entire job is supposed to be telling the two apart. Skorzeny's afterlife in popular culture is, in its own way, the clearest proof that the propaganda machine Goebbels built around him in 1943 never really stopped running, it just changed hands. Author Ian Fleming, creating the James Bond series in the years after the war, is cited by biographer Stuart Smith as having drawn on figures like Skorzeny when shaping the physically dominating, scar-marked villain archetype that would recur across Bond fiction for decades, a scarred, oversized, charismatic antagonist who operates just outside the reach of conventional law enforcement is, whether Fleming intended a direct reference or not, a description that fits Otto Skorzeny almost too well. The irony is direct. A man whose defining wartime skill was infiltration in disguise ended up, indirectly, helping shape the visual template for cinema's most famous fictional villains, men who are instantly, unmistakably recognizable, the exact opposite of what a real covert operative would ever want to be. That afterlife accelerated again in the 2010s and 2020s, as declassified files from multiple intelligence services finally became available to researchers and filmmakers at the same time. In 2020, a documentary titled Europe's Most Dangerous Man, Otto Skorzeny in Spain, directed by Pedro de Ichav and Pablo Azarin, was released, built around a private archive called The Skorzeny Papers and featuring interviews with his daughter, Waltraud Rees, alongside researchers who had gained access to previously unpublished 8mm home films and photographs from his personal collection, material that reframed him for a streaming-era audience as a Cold War fixer, arms-adjacent operator, and freelance intelligence asset, using Skorzeny's own family archive to tell a story his family had, until then, largely kept private. A year later, in 2021, the Spanish Netflix drama series Jaguar, a fictional story centered on a Nazi hunter in post-war Spain, built one of its central villains, a character named Otto Bachmann, at least partly on Skorzeny's real biography, taking the same geography, the same post-war Spanish exile, and the same general reputation, and turning it into serialized fiction for a new generation of viewers who'd likely never encountered the real Skorzeny's name before. Not every recent addition to the Skorzeny story holds up under scrutiny, and that deserves to be named directly rather than pretending the record is cleaner than it is. A 2018 book by researcher Ralph Gannis, The Skorzeny Papers, goes further than any mainstream historian and speculatively links Skorzeny to the 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy. That claim sits well outside the consensus of professional historians who study Skorzeny, and reviewers with deep expertise in Kennedy assassination research have criticized it sharply as unsupported by verifiable evidence. It belongs in any honest accounting of how the Skorzeny legend has continued to grow since his death, but it belongs there specifically as an example of fringe speculation, not as an established fact sitting alongside the documented history of Gran Sasso, Hungary, or the Battle of the Bulge. It's a useful closing data point for the entire arc of this video, in fact. 83 years after Gran Sasso and 50 years after Skorzeny's death, the same basic pattern that defined his life while he was alive, genuine documented events getting steadily overtaken by more dramatic, less verifiable claims, is still actively happening to his historical reputation, carried forward now by authors and filmmakers who never met him, working from archives he never fully controlled. The propaganda machine changed hands decades ago. It never actually stopped running. Skorzeny's health began to fail in the 1970s. In 1970, he had cancerous tumors removed from his spine at a hospital in Hamburg, a procedure that left him temporarily paralyzed from the waist down, though he reportedly recovered the ability to walk within roughly 6 months. It's a strange footnote to a life defined by physical dominance and daring, the man whose entire public identity had been built on being the largest, most physically capable figure in almost any room he entered, spending part of his final decade unable to stand. In February 1975, months before his death, he was publicly whipped outside a Paris television studio by a former French wartime deportee, an incident reported at the time by the French newspaper Le Monde, a small, sharp reminder that 30 years on, some people had not forgotten, and had not forgiven, what the SS uniform he'd worn had represented. Skorzeny had spent 30 years cultivating an image as a dashing, apolitical adventurer, a soldier's soldier whose loyalty was to his own code rather than to Nazi ideology. The whipping outside that Paris studio is a reminder that not everyone who'd lived through what the SS actually did in occupied Europe was willing to accept that framing. Otto Skorzeny died in Madrid on July 5, 1975, of lung cancer, at the age of 67. He was given a Catholic funeral on August 7 and cremated, his ashes eventually interred in Vienna, the city where the story had started 67 years earlier with a university engineering student and a dueling scar. At both his Madrid and Vienna funeral services, former SS comrades gathered, gave the Nazi salute, and sang songs that had been among Hitler's favorites, a final scene that, more than any single mission from the war itself, tells you exactly what Otto Skorzeny still meant, and to whom, 3 decades after Germany's surrender. He had never publicly renounced the ideology he'd served as a young man in Vienna, and the men who stood over his grave in 1975 made sure that fact was the last thing anyone watching would remember about him. Before closing this out, it helps to take stock of exactly how much of the Otto Skorzeny story genuinely remains unresolved, because that list turns out to be longer than most retellings acknowledge. The precise year Skorzeny joined the Austrian Nazi movement shifts between 1930, 1931, and 1932 depending on the source. His claimed intervention to save Austrian President Wilhelm Miklas during the 1938 Anschluss rests entirely on his own account, and so does his description of planned missions against the Lubyanka and the Moscow-Volga Canal sluice gates during the Battle of Moscow, neither of which has independent corroboration beyond his own memoirs. His famous line to Mussolini at Gran Sasso, and Hitler's famous reply, both circulate in versions that vary from source to source, none traceable to a verified contemporaneous transcript. Historians still disagree on the exact tank count and equipment inventory for Panzer Brigade 150, depending on whose figures you use. Nobody can trace the origin of the most dangerous man in Europe epithet that titles this very video to a single, specific, named wartime source. A single 1981 book is the sole origin of the 600 escapee figure attached to Die Spin, and it has never been independently verified. Legal historians have never seen a written explanation for the precise reasoning behind his own 1947 acquittal, because the tribunal that delivered it never recorded one. And the central fact of the Heinz Krug case, who actually killed him, and on whose direct order, remains disputed between 2 credible journalistic investigations published less than 2 years apart. That's not a small list, and it's not a list assembled to undermine the parts of the story that are genuinely well documented: the Hungarian coup, the Schwedt bridgehead, the Dachau trial's basic facts, the Spanish exile, the CIA's own internal uncertainty about him. It's a list assembled because a documentary about a man whose entire life was defined by the gap between reputation and reality owes its audience an honest accounting of exactly where that gap still sits, 80 years after Gran Sasso and 50 years after his death. None of these open questions are likely to resolve cleanly. The German military records that settled the Harold Moores question took the better part of 80 years to reach a wide audience, and they only did so because a specific institution, the Swiss National Museum, went back through operational planning documents that had sat, largely unexamined by popular historians, for decades. The Krug case may never resolve at all, given how much of it depends on the private, unrecorded memories of intelligence officers who are themselves now elderly or already deceased. What can be said with confidence is that the trend of the last decade of scholarship, Smith, González Lopez, Walters, Warbach, Brightman and Goda, has moved consistently in one direction, away from the version of Otto Skorzeny that dominated the 20th century, and toward a more careful, more heavily caveat, and ultimately more historically honest one. This is the story of Otto Skorzeny, the SS commando the Allies branded the most dangerous man in Europe, and whose most famous mission may not have been the one he actually planned. Strip away the post-war memoirs, the pulp paperbacks, and the propaganda Joseph Goebbels built around him in the autumn of 1943, and what's left is a genuinely capable, genuinely dangerous wartime officer, the real architect of the Hungarian coup that removed Miklos Horthy, a commander who held a defensive line on the Oder for a month under Soviet pressure, a man who improvised an entire disguised armored brigade out of roughly a tenth of the equipment he'd actually requested, wrapped inside a reputation that was, in large part, manufactured for him by a regime that needed a hero and by Skorzeny's own relentless talent for taking credit. The Gran Sasso raid that made him a household name across Europe was, according to the German military's own operational records, primarily planned and executed by Major Harold Moores, a name almost nobody watching a documentary about Otto Skorzeny has ever heard, and a name that deserves to be said out loud more often than it is. The vast Nazi smuggling network he was rumored to run after the war appears, according to the most rigorous historical investigation available, the US government's own interagency working group, to have been largely legend, the stuff of legend in their own words, a shadow organization built more out of Cold War paranoia than out of any real infrastructure Skorzeny actually controlled. Even the most explosive claim about his post-war life, that he personally killed a German scientist as a Mossad operative in 1962, remains genuinely disputed by the very journalists and historians who've investigated it most closely, split between two credible accounts that can't both be true. Trace the pattern across all three of those cases and something consistent emerges. In every one of them, the more dramatic version of the story, Skorzeny the mastermind, Skorzeny the network chief, Skorzeny the assassin, is the version that spread furthest and fastest, while the more careful, more corroborated, more heavily footnoted version struggled to get anywhere close to the same audience. That's not a coincidence, and it's not really unique to Otto Skorzeny either. A story spreads whenever it's more useful, to more people, than the truth is. Joseph Goebbels found the dramatic version useful in 1943, because Germany needed a hero after Mussolini's fall. Skorzeny himself found it useful in Madrid in the 1950s and 60s, because an internationally feared operator was safer than a denazified nobody. Multiple Cold War intelligence services found it useful too, since treating him as more dangerous and more connected than the declassified files now suggest he actually was made it easier to justify their own resources and attention. And 70 years of authors, filmmakers, and documentary producers have found it useful in a different way, because the legend simply makes for a better story than the caveats do. What remains, when you take all of that away, isn't a lesser story. It might be a more interesting one, a man who understood, better than almost anyone else of his generation, that in the 20th century, the story people believe about you can matter more than the story that's actually true, and who spent the 30 years between a mountaintop rescue in 1943 and a quiet death in Madrid in 1975 making absolutely sure the world kept believing his version. He very nearly succeeded completely. It's only in the last decade or so, with historians like Stuart Smith, Oscar González Lopez, and Danny Orbach finally working systematically back through the German, American, and Israeli archives, that the gap between Otto Skorzeny the myth and Otto Skorzeny the man has started to close, and even now, as the Krug case makes clear, some of that gap may never fully close at all. Major Harold Moores, the man who actually planned the raid at Gran Sasso, died decades ago with a fraction of the recognition given to the officer who simply landed first. That, in the end, might be the truest thing this video can say about Otto Skorzeny, not that he was Europe's most dangerous man, but that he understood, better than almost anyone standing next to him on that mountainside in September 1943, exactly how much a landing order was worth.